Welcome to another episode of Kitchen Sink Dharma. In Buddhist teachings, there's a lot of emphasis on something called noble friendship. And when we talk about noble friendship, we're talking really about friendship on the spiritual path. And the term in Pali is Kalyanamittata. And it comes up quite a bit in the earliest teachings. And the idea is that companionship with the wise is something that's really encouraged. And the encouragement wasn't just for monastics, it was for everybody, it was for householders, ordinary lay people, just folks like you and me. And we're encouraged to avoid harmful behaviour, choose true friends, and protect close relationships. And this is based on an understanding that the people that we choose to spend time with will have a big influence on us. And I think in our modern age, we're not just influenced by the people that we hang out with. We actually have all sorts of other influences. We have devices now, we have screens, we have TVs and phones and tablets and laptops. And we're really living in an attention economy. And the world makes these multiple relentless demands on our attention, and people pay a lot of money to get our attention and to hang on to it. And once it's captured, our behaviour can be shaped and manipulated. So it's not just the people we spend time with that influence us. And to some extent, what we attend to, what we spend our time looking at, we become. It shapes our mind. So the question in today's talk isn't just about who will you associate with. It's also about what are you going to allow in? What are you going to allow into your precious mind? Because many of us are very conscious about our health and our diet. And we're really careful about what we eat and drink, what we allow into the body. But that doesn't always apply to what we feed our minds. We don't always apply the same level of care to that. And actually whatever we choose to look at and whatever we choose to listen to is a bit like food for our minds. And a lot of what we encounter in this world just isn't conducive to our well-being. It doesn't support us, it doesn't nourish us. So negative news stories can really increase our sense of separation. Advertising can really manipulate our desires. And it's really, really easy to allow someone else to dictate the state of our heart and mind. And the world's actually constantly agitating us, without us even noticing. And I can remember years ago, I came home after being on a long silent retreat. And I was feeling very peaceful, and someone asked me to go to the pictures with them. And I thought, that'll be nice, an evening at the cinema. And some of you might know that when you've been on a retreat, you can often be in a very different state of mind. Your mind can be much more sensitive, more open, much more mindful of what's happening in the body. So we went to the pictures, and it was one of those films with just constant, unrelenting, violent action. There's all these exploding cars and things. It was the latest movie in the Mad Max franchise at the time. And the physical effect on the body of watching this was actually quite horrifying. And of course I was much more aware of the agitation than I would normally be. But it just felt like being beaten up. I was sitting there in the pictures thinking, why am I doing this to myself? And there are statistics around this. I think I read somewhere, by the age of 18, children will have seen something like 200,000 acts of violence on the television and 16,000 murders. And according to research, media violence hasn't just increased in quantity, it's also become much more graphic, it's become more sexual, more sadistic. And many of us just yearn for a more peaceful, contented life, and yet this agitation, it's not just all around us, we're swimming in it, we choose to swim in it. And it directly affects how we experience the world. So this is a translation of the opening lines of the Dhammapada, which is a set of verses that are attributed to the Buddha. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows, like a never-departing shadow. And there's another popular translation of these lines that starts, we are what we think. And all we are arises with our thoughts, and with our thoughts we make the world. With our thoughts we make the world. And it's often a world that feels unsafe, it feels stressful, it feels insufficient for our needs. And an awful lot of the time we don't actually respond to the present moment, we respond to the past. We take the information that we receive through our senses and we add in our memories and fears and expectations and our prejudices and our likes and dislikes. And we feed in our agitation. And when we're agitated, we label our experience, we categorize it as desirable or hateful, and we cling to it or we try and push it away. And instead of just allowing it to come and go, to arise and pass by itself, what we're doing is actually we're creating a world that's fundamentally unsatisfactory for us. It fundamentally feels unsafe, doesn't feel like home. And when we've got a mind that's calm, our response to the world we encounter is completely different. It's a far more peaceful, friendly world. And there's nothing missing at all. And that capacity for calm is something we can train ourselves in. And part of that is about making choices about where we direct our attention. And that can have a profound effect on this precious mind of ours and on how we experience the world. So modern psychology recognizes a lot of different processes running in the brain. And there's conscious processes, subconscious processes, rational, emotional processes, and so on. And while we're awake, we're taking information, and then the subconscious mind goes to work creating our reality, creates our world. And the problem is that most of the time, we're not actually filtering that information that we take in. We're not paying attention to what we let in. And we just allow in things that are out of line with our deepest values. And we allow in stuff that affects who we are and how we see the world. And here's another thing. We think the conscious, rational part of the mind is in charge, but it's not. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt used the analogy of someone riding an elephant to explain this. He said the emotional side of the mind is like the elephant, and the conscious side of the mind is the rider. And the rider of the elephant thinks they're in charge. It looks like they're in charge. But when there's a disagreement between the elephant and the rider, the elephant usually wins. It's stronger. The unconscious mind is much more powerful. And actually, when we master a skill, when we develop a skill or a habit, conscious mind just becomes a spectator. You'll know this if you drive a car, if you've ever played table tennis or all sorts of things. Often the conscious mind is barely intruding. You might think that consciousness actually represents the highest kind of thinking, but actually it runs quite slowly. And once a skill or a habit's been driven into the subconscious layer and you master it, it runs much more efficiently. We just get on with it. And that's great, we need to be wired that way, but the downside of it is that we can also become very efficient at acting out unskillful habits that create misery. These can also be driven into the subconscious layer. Now, luckily, our minds are very flexible, incredibly flexible, they're adaptable. We talk about neuroplasticity, the brain being able to be reshaped. We're not like hardware. In some ways, we're much more like software that can be changed. And our minds just keep getting written and rewritten over time. So, for example, I read about a team of psychologists in California, and they were studying kids at an outdoor camp where there were no devices, no phones. And after 5 days without their phones, the kids were much better at reading people's facial expressions, and their capacity to recognize emotions became much better than the children in a control group. And this was all just from putting down their devices and talking to each other face to face. We don't usually succeed in changing habits through a simple act of will. The elephant of our mind is way too strong for that. It doesn't allow us to order it about and just say, do this or stop doing that. We change our habits by changing some of the conditions in our lives. So, for example, by meditating, by cultivating mindfulness, we come back to the body, we breathe, we allow in some space, we remember what agitates us and we remember what nourishes us. And all of this is about taking care of this precious mind that we have. And one of my favorite words in the Pali language is appamada. Appamada, it's often translated as conscientiousness, often maybe care, carefulness, diligence, sometimes heedfulness, but I like the word care. To think of it as meaning care. Appamada isn't just taught as a wholesome quality. It's taught as one quality that holds all of the other ones. It sets the whole template about how to live. And I think our culture supports the opposite of that. It supports a kind of heedlessness, a carelessness of the mind. It's almost as though it doesn't matter what you let in and what you allow to stay there. But if your mind is the most precious thing that you have, it doesn't make much sense. Appamada, care if you like, protects us against ourselves. And it protects others from us as well. It asks us to stop and consider what we're doing. It reminds us to slow down and listen, leave some space, rather than just acting on impulse. And drama and agitation can be quite compelling. They can be quite addictive sometimes. But we don't always have to rush down that road. And Appamada stops us rushing down that road. It shows us there's another way. Christina Feldman, who's a teacher in the Insight meditation tradition, writes in her book about simplicity, "The mind that is at peace with itself finds peace in the world." And she goes on, "In a heart of loving kindness there is a falling away of layers of confusion born of hatred, dishonesty and greed. We can lay down the burden of all the residues and traces born of a disconnection with the world. We learn to release guilt, regret, fear and self-consciousness. The calm mind is an accessible mind. We can explore its pathways and mazes. We can understand it and find freedom within it. If we are to find simplicity in our lives, we need to find it within our own mind. If we're to find calm and peace in our lives, it will first be discovered within our own mind. Learning to understand the nature of the mind, we find the sources of simplicity." So that's from Christina Feldman. Finally, I just want to say that this isn't just about protecting the mind from harm, not just about filtering out what's harmful, it's also about how we feed the mind. It's about exposing it to what's going to enrich it, what's going to help it grow. So spending time in nature, I'm listening to a Dharma talk, listening to a podcast, listening to quiet music, or really connecting with another person, or sitting and walking in silence. These are things that have been skillful practices for a long time, and we can direct our attention to them, and it's a different way of being. Because I think deep down we know what's helpful, deep down we know what harms us. We don't always choose what's helpful, but I think on some level we know what's going to help us, what's going to nourish us. We don't actually need anybody to tell us. I think deep down we already know. So thank you, and I'll hopefully see you again soon on Kitchen Sink Dharma.